The following, although I don't have the details, is a true story. And I know it's true because a German sociologist in the 19th century named Max Weber wrote it down in his famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So here's the story. Once, way back in time, a landowner tried an innovative technique for the time to get more production out of his farm workers. See, he was paying his workers by the bushel harvested, and he wanted to harvest more bushels in a shorter amount of time. So he decided to pay them more per bushel, right? Makes sense, right? Incentive. Well, then an interesting thing happened, a really interesting thing happened. All the workers quit earlier. They worked until they had made the same amount that they made before, only now they had to harvest fewer bushels to do it, and then they went home. It's really hard to imagine that right now, right? You know, if we can earn more, we tend to do it. In fact, we tend to think that we should do it. But those workers thought that work should serve living, not living work. Why do we work? Why do we toil? Why do we work hard? Are we toiling only for transitory things, success, security, the desire to impress others or please others, the desire to earn the favor of others? Ecclesiastes and the gospel today both speak to work and saving and security. These are really fundamental aspects of our lives. Work, saving, security. And it's no accident that these two readings are paired this morning. Both speak to where we put our worries and our goals and our hopes, on our work and stuff, or on God and God's creation. My only regret about the way they paired the readings is that the Ecclesiastes passage, and that was a bit of a downer, that passage. It's a little bit kind of grim. Ecclesiastes kind of perks up a little bit. And later in it, there's the famous line that says, eat, drink, and be merry. And that line is no doubt what Jesus was referencing in his parable. So Jesus was probably making his audience think of that Ecclesiastes story when the rich fool says that he can now eat, drink, and be merry about 5 minutes before he croaks. At one level, why do we work, right? At one level, we work for food and clothes and shelter. And some security and some safety. These are pretty basic. In fact, there's good evidence that we as humans can often procure these basic necessities pretty easily. So let's take, for example, hunters and gatherers. For most of the existence of human beings on this planet, we as humans didn't farm or grow our food that way. We actually wandered about the landscape, gathering what had ripened and hunting whatever animals we could get a hold of. And it sounds like a pretty precarious existence. In fact, it has been described by some philosophers as nasty, brutish, and short. But actually, there's a famous anthropological study of hunters and gatherers that was titled The Original Affluent Society. The author of the study, a guy named Marshall Solomons, who I got to play basketball with in graduate school, found that many hunters and gatherers actually led very relaxed lives. They had lots of time for rest and for socializing and for play. The way we work now, and what we tend to think of as an affluent society, he suggested might be less fulfilling to us as humans. And I wonder if it isn't because we forget the reasons for being and the reasons for work. Our readings are about how we see our work, where we put our values, and in those cases where we do earn or produce more than the basic necessities of life, what do we do with those extra gifts that we receive? God gives us life, and God gives us abundant life. So what do we do with that abundance? As Ecclesiastes points out, work can be stressful. It can be a worry. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. That's what he calls it. That's actually a bit of a mistranslation. Vanity in English has a sense of pride or overbearing. In Hebrew, the words habel habalim, that's what the Hebrew words are that are translated as vanity of vanities. Literally, they mean breath of breaths or puff of puffs. The meaning is essentially, if a puff of air is nothing, then a puff of puffs is really nothing. And the point that the teacher is trying to make is that the things that we put a lot of our worry on, our toil and our mental energy, they're fleeting. They're transitory. They're no more than a puff of wind. They're fleeting breaths breathed out of a fleeting breath. And I think at some level we do know this. We all recognize, even in the midst of crises and difficult times and stressful moments, usually if you've got a group of people working together, at some point in a crisis you'll start laughing as you realize that there really are things in life that are more important than whatever you might be struggling with or fighting over at a moment. So that is definitely an insight. But I think that Ecclesiastes has even bigger insights than that. What the teacher does, the word in Hebrew I love as well is koheleth, the teacher. What the teacher does is create for us a strong sense that many of the things that the world and we tend to see as so important are only important inasmuch as they are part of God's creation and God's story. And Ecclesiastes makes it clear that we may not know that story. We may not see it. We may not even know the meaning of it. But he makes it very, very clear that we are part of God's story. And so for me then, what Ecclesiastes does is raise the question of what should I worry about? Or, better yet, where should I put the focus of my life? So Jesus today retells this story in his parable of the rich fool. And there's a surprising point in the parable, like in all parables. There's a moment that kind of catches you. And in this parable, it's when the rich fool says, "And I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Well, the expression we often use, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, is taken quite literally in this parable. And just as the rich man is kicking it with a tall, frosty one in his lawn chair, he keels over dead. And so perhaps he thought he was following Ecclesiastes. But the outcome wasn't what he hoped for. And so in a way, what Jesus is doing is really accentuating and clarifying Ecclesiastes. One is not simply to eat, drink, and be merry because life is pointless, or because, hey, you got something, have as much fun with what you got while you can. No, actually what Jesus is saying is that there are greater purposes to our work. There are greater purposes. To understand that, you have to realize that when Jesus told this story, people believed in what we now call the idea of limited goods. Okay, and I'll explain limited goods by explaining the opposite. Nowadays, we don't tend to believe this. We tend to believe in unlimited goods. We have a sense that goods and things are just, in some degree, possible to continually create. We don't tend to think, we think if we start running low on something, we can make more of it. Or we can go dig up more of it, or go find more of it. And we have that sort of as part of our assumption about how the world works. And we certainly don't think that if one individual person has more of one thing, they took it out of the pockets directly of another person. We tend to believe in rising tides raise all boats and all that kind of good stuff. So we tend to believe instead of it's a limited pie, it's a big, big pie, and everybody has different sized slices of a very big pie that can continue to get bigger. But in Jesus' time, people did not believe in that. They believed that there was a limited number of everything, of material goods, of money, of food, even of honor and status. And if one person had more, other people, it was coming right out of the pockets of someone else. And so the honorable response to getting a surplus, to having an abundance of things like the rich man gained, would be to share it generously with the community. However, the rich man did not. He kept it for himself, thinking that would satisfy his very nature, his soul, his psyche, his being. And so what happens? God redistributes it. God takes his life and his gain goes to others, just as the teacher in Ecclesiastes says it will. Just as the small communities in Israel knew in their wisdom that it would be. I want to be clear. The Bible doesn't tell us that we don't deserve a roof over our heads or clothes on our backs. It doesn't tell us that we should never work in order to feed our children or even to save up in case of emergencies. Those are pretty basic things that we all need. And in fact, I think what the bigger picture in the Bible is that it's saying that nobody should have to worry about these things. What the Bible does for us is remind us that we should always live in honor of the fact that we are part of God's story. A story that is bigger than all of us. And so how do we reorient our lives to God's story? That's what these stories that we hear today are telling us, or are asking us, or are making us think. And it may be as simple as looking to the wisdom of the small communities that first heard these stories. They remind us of the basics, that our life is precious, a gift from God, far more important than anything or stuff that we think we need. And sometimes we do need things. Food, shelter, clothing, a roof over our heads, medical care. And, it's okay to look to our community for care. And as a community, we look to everyone else. Sometimes we look to our community, and sometimes when we have abundance, we turn around and look outward. And there's many ways of doing this. And I want you to know that we're doing it here at St. Stephen's. I want to draw your attention to it. When we care for each other, when we check on each other, when you guys let me know if someone you think needs a visit or anything like that, you're doing that. You are looking out. When we work on mission, the various upcoming mission things that we have going on, the education initiative, the literacy action ball, when we start looking outward, when you contribute your time or your efforts to those types of things, that's what we're doing. And finally, actually very fundamentally, your stewardship, your pledging, the financial support that you give to this place is another way of reorienting your life to God's story. It's a way of turning first and saying, my money, my things, don't rule me. It's a way of rethinking your possessions, making them part of God's story and not your story. The gifts of the world are for life, abundant for all. And we acknowledge that in our pledging here or in any charitable giving and working that we do. Working on Monday with the food bank, as I'll be talking about. When we give our things and our time and our hearts. And also, I can't help but point out when I think of storehouses, I think of my discretionary fund. I don't know how many of you know that I have a discretionary fund. I use it to help people both in the parish and in the community who are in need, who simply have hit rough spots and need something to get over the hump. And to me, it's like a storehouse. Money goes into it, and then as need arises, money can go out. And your pledges fill that storehouse. In the southwestern corner of Nicaragua, there's a huge lake called, interestingly enough, Lake Nicaragua. If you look at it on Google Earth, it's very clear. And on this lake is a large string of islands called Solentiname. And in the 1970s, only desperately poor families lived on these islands. And many of them would meet each Sunday at their church for both worship and Bible study. And the priest leading this Bible study recorded and then published their conversations. And they're fascinating take on them. The people have insights that only the very poor would have, which is very important because Jesus most often preached to the poor. And I looked up what they had to say about the parable of the rich fool. And a member of the community of Solentiname named William offered this insight on today's gospel. He said, Jesus says that life doesn't depend on having. It depends on being. May we shape all our life, all our work, all our being to God's story.